The morning after Victoria woke to sunlight streaming through her small apartment window and the immediate memory of the previous night crashing over her, she reached for her phone with dread, knowing what she would find. Social media exploded with images and videos of her humiliation, but something unexpected had shifted the narrative. The photos of Nathan's cruel dismissal were now paired with images of Julian Westbrook taking her hand, defending her, dancing with her. Comments ranged from curiosity to admiration, and some even criticized Nathan for his public cruelty. Victoria set the phone down, unsure how to feel about being the center of attention for entirely new reasons. An expected message, 2 days passed, in a blur of work and worry. Victoria threw herself into spreadsheets at the accounting firm, grateful for numbers that made sense when her emotions did not. She visited her father at the hospital each evening, sitting beside his bed while he slept, finding comfort in his steady breathing. She had not told him about the gala, could not bear to add worry to his already fragile health. On the third morning, her phone chimed with a message from an unknown number. "I hope you are doing well. Would you consider meeting for coffee?" Julian. Victoria stared at the screen for nearly an hour, her thumb hovering over the keyboard countless times before she finally typed a simple response. Yes. The coffee shop the cafe Julian chose was nothing like the grand ballroom. Tucked on a quiet street corner, it had mismatched wooden chairs, local art on brick walls, and the warm smell of fresh pastries filling the air. Victoria arrived 10 minutes early, her nerves making her pace outside until she saw Julian approaching. He wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, looking remarkably different from the formal figure who had commanded the gala. When he smiled at her, it reached his eyes, and Victoria felt some of her tension ease. They sat at a corner table, and he ordered them both coffee without the pretense that often accompanied wealth. Learning to trust Julian did not begin with grand statements or explanations. Instead, he asked how her week had been, how she was handling the attention online, whether her work had been affected. His questions were genuine, his listening attentive. Victoria found herself answering honestly, sharing how exhausted she felt, how strange it was to be recognized by strangers, how she worried about her father seeing the news. Julian nodded with understanding, never interrupting, never redirecting the conversation to himself. When he did speak about his own life, it was not about business success or philanthropic achievements, but about loss and loneliness. He told her about Caroline, about how grief had taught him to value authentic connection over social performance. Walls begin to crumble. They met again the following week, this time for a walk through the city park. Autumn leaves scattered across the paths, and the crisp air made conversation feel easier somehow. Victoria talked about her childhood, about growing up with a single father who worked construction to give her opportunities. She spoke about the scholarship that got her through university, the job she juggled to stay afloat, the constant feeling of being one crisis away from losing everything. Julian listened without judgment, asking questions that showed he truly wanted to understand her world. He shared his own struggles with expectation, how inheriting wealth had come with pressure to maintain legacy, how loneliness could exist even in crowded rooms. Discovering common ground over the next few weeks, their meetings became regular. Sometimes they shared meals at small restaurants Julian knew, places where the food mattered more than the decor. Other times they simply sat on park benches, talking about books they loved or dreams they had set aside. Victoria discovered that Julian was not the untouchable figure she had imagined. He struggled with insomnia, missed his late wife with an ache that time had softened but not erased, and questioned whether his charitable work truly made a difference. She found herself opening up in ways she never had with Nathan, sharing fears and hopes without the constant worry of being judged insufficient. Meeting her father one evening, Julian asked if he could visit her father with her. Victoria hesitated, protective of the one relationship that had never disappointed her. But something in Julian's request felt genuine, not like he was checking a box or performing kindness. At the hospital, Robert Hayes was awake and alert, his weathered face lighting up when Victoria entered. She introduced Julian simply, without titles or explanations. Robert shook Julian's hand with the firm grip of a man who had worked with his hands all his life. They talked about construction, about the buildings Robert had helped create across the city. And Julian listened with real interest, asking questions about techniques and challenges. A father's blessing after an hour. Robert grew tired and they prepared to leave. As Victoria kissed her father's forehead, he caught Julian's eye and gave a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that needed no words. Outside the hospital, Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. "He liked you," she said quietly. Julian smiled. "He is a good man. I can see where you learned your strength." The comment caught Victoria off guard. She had never thought of herself as strong, always saw herself as merely surviving. But Julian's perspective was shifting something inside her, helping her see her own resilience in a new light. Vulnerability and truth on a rainy afternoon in Julian's penthouse. Surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Victoria finally asked the question that had haunted her. "Why did you really help me that night? You could have anyone do anything. I was just a stranger being humiliated." Julian set down his coffee cup and met her eyes directly. "Because I saw myself in you. When Caroline died, people treated my grief like entertainment. I was photographed at my lowest, my pain dissected in magazines. I learned that cruelty often comes from people who have forgotten what it means to suffer. I could not watch someone else endure that without trying to help." The crystal chandeliers of the Paramount Grand Hall scattered light across marble floors like fallen stars. Victoria Hayes smoothed the fabric of her modest emerald dress, her fingers trembling slightly as she walked beside Nathan Pierce through the towering oak doors. This charity gala was unlike anything she had experienced. Women glided past in designer gowns that cost more than her yearly rent. While men in tailored tuxedos discussed business deals worth millions, Victoria had spent weeks preparing for this night. Believing it would mark a turning point in her 3-year relationship with Nathan, hopes and hidden. Doubts she had met Nathan during his struggling years when he was building his career in finance. Victoria had worked double shifts at the accounting firm and weekend jobs at a bookstore to help support them both. She had skipped meals to afford his networking dinners, had stayed up late reviewing his presentations, and had believed every promise he made about their future together. Now that Nathan had climbed the corporate ladder and moved in elite circles, Victoria hoped he would finally introduce her as the woman who stood by him. Her heart carried a fragile hope that tonight would erase the months of feeling invisible, the canceled dates. The phone calls cut short because important people needed his attention. The gathering stormed the ballroom, hummed with conversation and classical music from a live orchestra. Waiters in white gloves carried champagne on silver trays, and laughter echoed from corners where influential guests gathered. Victoria noticed how Nathan's posture changed as they entered. His shoulders straightened, his smile became practiced, and his hand on her arm felt less like affection and more like obligation. She pushed the thought away, reminding herself of the small velvet box she had seen in his apartment drawer last week. Perhaps tonight would bring an engagement, a public declaration that she mattered. The first cracks Nathan guided her toward a group of his colleagues, men in expensive suits and women dripping with jewelry. Victoria recognized some faces from business magazines. Her stomach tightened with nervous energy. She rehearsed a polite greeting in her mind, adjusted her posture, and tried to look confident. Nathan's grip on her arm tightened as they approached, but something in his eyes had changed. The warmth she once knew had vanished, replaced by cold calculation. He stopped a few feet from the group. Victoria felt the shift in the air like a coming storm. Words shattered everything. The music seemed to fade as Nathan turned to face her. His voice carried across the space between them, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear every syllable. "You are not worth it." The words struck Victoria like physical blows. She blinked, certain she had misheard, but the smirk pulling at Nathan's lips confirmed the truth. Around them, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Someone gasped. Victoria's mind raced to make sense of what was happening, but her body remained frozen. Nathan released her arm and stepped away. His movement deliberate and final. The crowd becomes cruel within seconds. Nathan was greeting a woman in a crimson gown. Camilla Cross, daughter of a real estate mogul, leaned in to kiss his cheek as though Victoria had never existed. The group of colleagues smiled, some awkwardly, others with barely concealed amusement. Victoria stood alone in the center of attention she had never wanted. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Phones lifted, camera lenses pointing at her like weapons. A woman nearby muttered to her companion, and they both laughed behind manicured hands. Someone else pulled out their phone, typing rapidly. No doubt sharing the spectacle on social media, trapped in humiliation, Victoria wanted to run, to disappear through the marble floors, but her legs refused to move. The emerald dress that had made her feel elegant now felt like a costume, a poor imitation of belonging. She clutched her small purse until her knuckles turned white, fighting against the tears burning behind her eyes. Memories flooded back with cruel clarity. Every sacrifice she had made, every time she had chosen Nathan over her own needs, every promise he had whispered during their early days together. All of it had led to this moment of public destruction, the weight of judgment. The ballroom that had seemed magical now felt like a prison. Every glittering surface reflected her shame. The orchestra played on, but Victoria could only hear the whispers and muffled laughter. She saw a man across the room, recording her on his phone, not even bothering to hide it. Two women in diamond necklaces leaned close together, their eyes darting toward Victoria as they exchanged words. The humiliation was not just emotional, but physical. Her chest tightened until each breath hurt. Her vision blurred at the edges. The chandelier lights became too bright, too harsh, exposing every flaw she had tried to hide. A father's daughter in that crushing moment. Victoria thought of her father lying in a hospital bed across town. Robert Hayes had worked construction for 40 years, breaking his body to give his daughter opportunities he never had. He was battling pneumonia now, his lungs weakened from decades of hard labor. Victoria had promised him she would build a better life, that his sacrifices would not be in vain. Yet here she stood, publicly discarded by a man who had never deserved her loyalty. The weight of that failure pressed down on her shoulders, and she wondered if she had the strength to remain standing. The crowd continued to stare, to whisper, to judge. And Victoria remained frozen at the center of her worst nightmare, unable to escape the merciless spotlight of their cruelty. A stranger's observation, Julian Westbrook sat at a private table near the orchestra, a glass of champagne untouched before him. He had attended countless galas like this one, events where wealth and status created invisible barriers between people. Philanthropy was his passion, not the social theater that accompanied it. Yet tonight, something pulled his attention from the usual pleasantries. Across the ballroom, he watched a young woman in an emerald dress standing completely still while the crowd around her whispered and pointed. Her face held a mixture of shock and pain that Julian recognized immediately. He had worn that expression himself years ago, when tragedy had struck his life in full public view. Recognition of Panulian's late wife, Caroline, had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. The media had descended on his grief like vultures, turning his most private moments into headlines and speculation. He remembered standing at her funeral while cameras flashed, while strangers offered empty condolences for the sake of appearances. That experience had taught him to recognize authentic suffering, and the woman in emerald was drowning in it. He watched a man walk away from her, toward another woman in red. Watched phones lift to capture her humiliation, and felt anger rise in his chest. The cruelty was deliberate, performed for an audience that fed on drama. The decision to act. Julian set down his glass and stood. His assistant seated nearby looked up in surprise. "Sir, the dinner program starts in 10 minutes. Julian barely heard him. His focus remained on the young woman who seemed unable to move, trapped in the spotlight of mockery. He had wealth and influence that could shield her, could redirect the narrative with a single gesture. Some part of him knew this was impulsive, that intervening in a stranger's personal drama carried risks. But a stronger part remembered being powerless in his own moment of public pain and refused to let someone else endure it alone. Crossing the distance, Julian moved through the crowd with quiet authority. Guests recognized him and stepped aside, their conversations faltering as they noticed his trajectory. He was heading directly toward the woman everyone was whispering about, and speculation rippled through the room. What was Julian Westbrook, one of the city's most respected philanthropists, doing approaching her? Victoria saw him coming but could not process what was happening. Her mind was still reeling from Nathan's rejection, from the phones recording her shame. Then this tall stranger with kind eyes stood before her, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, and offered Angeline extended his hand, palm open, his voice steady and clear enough to carry. "If he thinks you are not worth it, then let me show you how wrong he is." The words cut through the whispers like a bell. Victoria stared at his hand, her thoughts a chaotic storm. She recognized him from news articles and charitable foundations. Julian Westbrook did not involve himself in petty social dramas. Yet here he stood, offering her a lifeline in front of hundreds of witnesses. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to walk away with whatever dignity remained. But something in his gaze stopped her. There was no pity there, no condescension. Only a calm certainty that seemed to say she deserved better than this cruelty. The dance that changed everything slowly. Victoria placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was warm and steady, and she felt some of her panic ease. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Cameras that had been recording her humiliation now captured something entirely different. Julian led her to the center of the dance floor, as the orchestra, sensing the moment, began a waltz. Victoria's steps were uncertain at first, her body stiff with shock and fear. But Julian's hand at her back was firm, guiding her through the movements. "Focus on me," he said quietly. "Nothing else matters right now." She lifted her eyes to his and found an anchor there. A steady presence that kept her from falling apart. The shift in power, they moved across the floor with growing grace. And Victoria became aware of the crowd's changing energy. The mockery had transformed into astonishment. Women who had laughed now watched with envy. Men who had ignored her now studied her with new interest. Across the room, Nathan stood rigid, his face darkening with anger and disbelief. Camilla tugged at his arm, clearly uncomfortable with the attention shifting away from them. For the first time that evening, Victoria felt something other than shame. It was not happiness, not yet, but a flicker of power reclaimed. Julian spun her gently, and her dress caught the light, transforming her from a discarded object into the center of something beautiful. Confrontation and defense as the dance ended. Applause broke out, hesitant but genuine. Julian bowed slightly, still holding Victoria's hand, and she managed a small curtsy. Before they could step away, Nathan appeared, his face tight with rage. "So this is your game," he spat, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You could not handle being left, so you throw yourself at the first wealthy man who looks your way." Victoria flinched, the old wounds tearing open again. But Julian stepped forward, placing himself between them. His voice remained calm, but carried an edge of steel. "That is enough." A public declaration, a faltered, but he pressed on. "You do not know her. She is nothing but a desperate woman pretending to belong in a world beyond her reach." The cruelty in his words sent murmurs through the watching crowd. Julian's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice rang clear across the ballroom. "She is worth more than you will ever realize." The declaration silenced the room. Even the orchestra seemed to pause. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever defended her like this. Certainly not publicly, certainly not against the judgment of an entire room. Julian's words were not just a response to Nathan, but a proclamation that challenged everyone who had participated in her humiliation. The aftermath of Courage Nathan's confidence crumbled under the weight of Julian's unwavering gaze and the crowd's shifting sympathy. He muttered something inaudible and stalked away, pulling Camilla behind him. The guests who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable, some even ashamed. Victoria stood beside Julian, trembling not from fear but from the overwhelming release of tension. She turned to him, trying to find words adequate for what he had just done. "Why would you risk this for me?" she whispered. Julian looked at her with an expression that held both sadness and resolve. "Because I know what it feels like to be torn apart in public. I could not stand by and watch it happen to someone else." A new beginning. The orchestra resumed playing, and the crowd slowly returned to their conversations. Though glances still flickered toward Victoria and Julian, he offered his arm and she took it, allowing him to guide her away from the dance floor toward the quieter edges of the ballroom. For the first time since entering this glittering hall, Victoria felt she could breathe. The humiliation had not vanished, but it no longer defined her. Someone had seen her worth when the world tried to erase it, and that changed everything. As they walked together through the watching crowd, Victoria realized the night had transformed from her worst nightmare into something unexpected. Not a rescue that diminished her, but a reminder that dignity could be reclaimed. That cruelty did not have to win, and that sometimes strength came from the most unexpected sources. Understanding grows. Victoria absorbed his words. Understanding dawning. Julian had not rescued her out of pity or performance. He had recognized her pain because he carried his own. And his intervention had been an act of shared humanity rather than heroism. She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible." Julian's expression softened. "You were never invisible. You were just surrounded by people too shallow to notice your light." The words settled into Victoria's heart. Not as flattery, but as truth she was finally ready to receive. A new chapter begins. As weeks turned into months, something profound developed between them. It was not the desperate attachment Victoria had felt with Nathan, built on hope and fear of abandonment. This was something steadier, built on mutual respect and genuine understanding. They challenged each other, supported each other's growth, and created space for both strength and vulnerability. Victoria found herself laughing more, dreaming bigger, believing that perhaps she did belong in spaces she had once thought were beyond her reach. Not because Julian granted her access, but because she was learning to grant it to herself. Transformation complete, the woman who had stood frozen in humiliation at the gala no longer existed. In her place stood Victoria Hayes, accountant, devoted daughter, and someone learning to recognize her own worth. Julian had been the catalyst, but the transformation was hers alone. She had learned that dignity could not be given or taken by others, that her value existed independent of anyone's recognition, and that sometimes the most unexpected connections could help us see ourselves clearly. As she looked out at the city lights beside Julian, Victoria realized the gala had not been an ending, but a beginning. The rejection that had nearly broken her had instead freed her to find something real, and that made all the difference.